Today we're going to be reviewing Chapter 23, which is about the Gilded Age. The Bloody Shirt elects Grant. Ulysses S. Grant was a good general, and the populace was soured by the wrangling of professional politicians during Reconstruction. But the notion still prevailed that a good general would make a good president. So Grant is the most popular Northern hero. He was really unexperienced in the political arena. His one presidential vote that he had ever cast was cast for a Democratic ticket in 1856, and his cultural background was breathtakingly narrow. The Republicans had been freed from the Union Party coalition of the war days, and they nominated Grant for the presidency in 1868. The platform called for continued Reconstruction of the South, with Grant's quotable quote, "Let us have peace." The Democrats, in their nominating convention, denounced military Reconstruction, but couldn't agree on anything else. They disagreed about wealthy Eastern delegates who were demanding federal war bonds be redeemed in gold. Poor Midwestern delegates called for redemption in greenbacks, and the debt-burdened agrarian Democrats hoped to keep more money in circulation and keep interest rates low. These disputes introduced a bitter contest over monetary policy that continues to the century's end. The Midwestern delegates got the platform, but not the candidate. The nominee, Horatio Seymour, really did not support any of the Ohio ideas. Grant was nominated, and the Republicans energetically nominated him by waving the bloody shirt, reviving glory memories of the Civil War. He became for the first time the war became a prominent feature of a presidential campaign. Grant won with 214 electoral votes to 80, and the majority of the popular votes. Most white voters supported Seymour, however, but the ballots of 3 still unreconstructed southern states, Mississippi, Texas, and Virginia, were not at all counted in the election. An estimated 500,000 former slaves gave Grant his margin of victory. To remain in power, the Republican Party had to continue to control the South and to keep the ballot in the hands of the grateful freedmen. The Republicans could not take future victories for granted. This is a political cartoon by Thomas Nast attacking Boss Tweed, who can be seen larger than life in this political cartoon. And he was a corrupt person involved in politics in New York, and we'll talk about him as we move on through the video. The post-war atmosphere after the Civil War stunk of corruption. Some railroad promoters cheated gullible bond buyers. Some unethical financiers manipulated the stock market, and too many judges and legislators put their power up for hire. Cynics defined an honest politician as one who, when bought, stayed bought. 2 notorious financial millionaire partners were Jubilee Jim Fisk and Jay Gould. They were corpulent and unscrupulous, and Fisk provided the brass. The undersized and cunning Gould provided the brains, and they concocted a plot in 1869 to corner the gold market. This plan would work only if the federal treasury refrained from selling gold. The conspirators worked on President Grant directly, and through his brother-in-law, who received $25,000 for his complicity, they were able to hoodwink Grant. For weeks, Fisk and Gould bid the price of gold skyward so they could profit from its heightened value. On Black Friday, September 24, 1889, the bubble broke when the Treasury was compelled to release the gold. The price of gold plunged, and scores of honest business people were driven to the wall. And a congressional probe concluded that Grant had nothing to do with the corruption, but that he had acted stupidly. The infamous Tweed ring displayed the ethics of the age. Boss Tweed, who was seen in the previous political cartoon, employed bribery, graft, and fraudulent elections to milk the metropolis of $200 million, and this is New York City. Honest citizens cowered in silence. Protesters found tax assessments were raised, and Tweed's luck would finally run out, with the New York Times publishing a damning article with evidence in 1871, and he refused a $5 million bribe not to publish it. The gifted cartoonist Thomas Nast, who did the previous political cartoon, pilloried Tweed mercilessly. The New York attorney Samuel Tilden headed the prosecution. Unbailed and unwept, Tweed died behind bars. The misdeeds of the federal government leaders continued in this administration in the credit mobilier scandal of 1872. The Union Pacific Railroad insiders formed the Credit Mobilier Construction Company. They then hired themselves at inflated prices to build the railroad line. They earned dividends as high as 348%, and the company distributed shares of its valuable stock to key congressmen. A newspaper expose and congressional investigation will lead to formal censure of 2 congressmen and the revelation that the vice president accepted payments from Credit Mobilier. The breath of the scandal in Washington reeked of alcohol. In 1874 to 1875, the whiskey ring, another ring of corruption, robbed the Treasury of millions in excise tax revenue. Grant's own private secretary was among the culprits, and Grant volunteered a written statement to the jury that helped exonerate the thief. There were many bribes. The Secretary of War, William Belknap, was forced to resign after pocketing bribes from suppliers to Indian reservations. Grant accepted his resignation with great regret. The Liberal Republican Party slogan in 1872 was "Turn the Rascals Out," and urged purification of Washington and an end to military reconstruction. The muffed chants when, at the Cincinnati Convention, they nominated an erratic Horace Greeley, who was the editor of the New York Tribune. He was dogmatic, emotional, petulant, and notoriously unsound in his political judgments. The Democrats in 1872 endorsed Greeley's candidacy. He had blasted them as traitors, slave shippers, saloon keepers, horse thieves, and idiots. He pleased them when he pleaded for clasping hands across the bloody chasm. The Republicans dutifully renominated Grant, even after all the corruption, and the voters had to choose between 2 non-politicians, neither of whom was truly qualified. This is a political cartoon that says, "Can Greeley and the Democrats swallow each other?" You can pause and read the explanation. In the election of 1872, the Republicans denounced Greeley as an atheist, communist, free lover, vegetarian, and co-signer of Jefferson Davis's bail bond. The Democrats derided Grant as an ignoramus, drunkard, swindler. The Republicans were chanting, "Grant us another term," and they pulled the president through the election. The electoral count was 286 for Grant and 66 for Greeley, and the popular vote, Grant still basically won the popular vote as well. In the Panic of 1873, which soon followed, this basically deepened the woes that Grant was already experiencing with the economy. This was the age of unbridled expansion. There were overreaching promoters that were laying more railroad tracks, sinking more mines, erecting more factories, sowing more grain fields than existing markets could bear. So the bankers made too many impudent loans to finance these enterprises, so profits failed to materialize, loans went unpaid, and the whole credit-based economy fluttered downward. Boom times became gloom times as more than 15,000 businesses went bankrupt. Black Americans were hard hit. The Freedmen's Saving and Trust Company had made unsecured loans to several companies that went under. Black depositors who had entrusted over $7 million to banks lost their entire savings. Black economic development and black confidence in savings institutions went down as a result. Hard times were inflicted, the worst punishment on debtors. Proponents of inflation breathed new life into issues of greenbacks, and the agrarian and debtor groups wanted more cheap money supporters, and they clamored for the reissuance of greenbacks. Hard money advocates carried the day. In 1874, they persuaded Grant to veto the bill to print more paper money, and they scored another victory in the Resumption Acts in 1875, which pledged the government to further withdraw greenbacks from circulation and to redemption of all paper currency in gold at face value beginning in 1879. Debtors looked for relief in precious metal silver. In 1870, the Treasury maintained an ounce of silver worth only 1/16 compared to an ounce of gold. Silver miners stopped offering silver to federal mints. Congress dropped coinage of silver dollars in 1873. With new silver discoveries in the late 1870s, production shot up, which forced silver prices to drop. The demand for coinage of more silver was nothing more nor less than another scheme to promote inflation. Hard money Republicans resisted the scheme and called on Grant to hold the line, and he did not disappoint them. The Treasury accumulated gold stocks until the day of the resumption of metallic money payments. That was coupled with reduction of greenbacks. This policy was called contraction. It had a noticeable deflationary effect on the economy, worsening the impact of the Depression. The new policy restored the government's credit rating. It brought the embattled greenbacks up to face value. When the redemption day came in 1879, few greenback holders bothered to exchange the lighter, more convenient bills for gold. The Republican hard money policy had political backlashes. In 1874, they helped elect the Democratic House of Representatives, and in 1878 it spawned the Greenback Labor Party, which polled over 1 million votes and elected 14 members of Congress. The contest over monetary policy was far from over. The Gilded Age was a sarcastic name given to the 3-decade-long post-Civil War era by Mark Twain in 1873. Every presidential election was a squeaker. The majority party in the House switched 6 times in 7 sessions between 1869 and 1891. There were very few significant economic issues that separated major parties, yet elections were furiously competitive, and nearly 80% of those that were eligible voted. How can the paradox of political consensus and partisan fervor be explained? There were sharp ethnic and cultural differences in membership of both parties. The distinctions of style and tone, especially in religious sentiment, were very different. The Republicans adhered to creeds that traced the lineage to Puritanism and had strict codes of personal morality and believed that the government should play a role in regulating both economic and moral affairs of society. The Democrats were mostly immigrant Lutherans and Roman Catholics, and they were more likely to adhere to faiths that took a less stern view of human weakness. The religion professed toleration in an imperfect world, and they spurned government efforts to impose a single moral standard in the entire society. Differences in temperament and religious values produced raucous political contests at the local level, especially on issues like prohibition and education. The Democrats had a solid electoral base in the South, in the northern industrial cities with immigrants and well-oiled political machines. The Republicans had their strength largely in the Midwest and the rural small-town Northeast, and the freedmen in the South continued to vote Republican in significant numbers. Members of the Grand Army of the Republic, called the GAR, were a political potent fraternal organization of several 100,000 Union veterans of the Civil War. Patronage was the lifeblood of both parties. Jobs for votes, kickbacks, and party service are all examples of patronage. There was boisterous infighting over patronage that beset the Republican Party in the 1870s and 1880s. Roscoe, called Lord Roscoe Conkling, embraced the time-honored system of civil service jobs for votes. This is a picture called The Political Legacy of the Civil War, which represents Union veterans and members of the Grand Army of the Republic. Half-breeds wanted some civil service reform. The champion of this was James G. Blaine of Maine. There were 2 personalities. The 2 personalities succeeded only in stalemating each other and in deadlocking the party. Grant was thought about a 3rd term, but then the House derailed this by a 233-18 vote, and they passed a resolution. They passed a resolution on the anti-dictator implications of a 2-term tradition. The Republicans turned to compromise candidate Rutherford B. Hayes, who was the great unknown. He was the foremost qualification that he held was that he hailed from the swing state of Ohio, and he served 3 terms as governor. The Democratic nominee was Samuel Tilden. He had risen to fame by jailing Boss Tweed in New York. He had 185 electoral votes that he needed, and Tilden got 184 with 20 disputed votes in 4 states, 3 of them in the South. So Tilden polled more popular votes than Hayes, but both parties sent the visiting statesman to contested Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. This is the results of the 1876 election by electoral vote, which is a disputed election between Hayes and Tilden, and you can pause and read the explanation. The disputed states all sent 2 sets of returns, 1 Democratic and 1 Republican. This became a Democratic constitutional crisis. The Constitution merely specified that electoral returns from states be sent to Congress. Then, in the presence of the House and Senate, They were to be opened by the President of the Senate, which is, you can look up the 12th Amendment in the appendix, which details the process. But who should count them? On this point, the Constitution is silent. If counted by the President of the Senate, who was a Republican, Republican returns would be selected. If counted by the Speaker of the House, a Democrat, Democratic returns would be chosen. So how could this impasse be resolved? It was resolved with the Compromise of 1877. The deadlock is broken by the Election Count Act, which is passed by Congress in early 1877. This set up an Electoral Commission of 15 men selected from the Senate, House, and Supreme Court. And in February 1877, a month before Inauguration Day, the Senate and the House met to settle the dispute of who would be president. This is the table of the composition of the Electoral Commission of 1877. The roll of states told off alphabetically. Florida, the first of the 3 southern states with 2 sets of returns, disputed the documents referred to the Electoral Commission, which sat in the nearby chamber. And after a prolonged discussion, the members, by partisan vote of 8 Republicans to 7 Democrats, voted to accept the Republican returns. And outraged Democrats in Congress, smelling defeat, undertook to launch a filibuster. The other parts of the Compromise of 1877, the Democrats agreed that Hayes might take the office in return for removing U.S. troops from 2 states in which they remained, Louisiana and South Carolina, effectively ending military reconstruction. The Republicans assured the Democrats a place at presidential patronage, which means they assured them that they would get political offices. And this supported bill subsidizing Texas and Pacific Railroad's construction of the Southern Transcontinental Railroad line. The deal was held together long enough to break the dangerous electoral standoff. Democrats permitted Hayes to receive the remainder of the disputed returns, all by partisan vote of 8-7. So explosive, it was settled only 3 days before the new president was supposed to be sworn into office. The compromise brought peace at a price. Partisan violence was averted by sacrificing the civil rights of Southern blacks. And with the Hayes and Tilden deal, the Republican Party abandoned its commitment to racial equality. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 was the last gasp of the feeble radical Republicans. The Supreme Court pronounced much of the act unconstitutional in the civil rights cases of 1883. The court declared the 14th Amendment prohibited only government violation of civil rights, not denial of civil rights by individuals. When President Hayes withdrew federal troops that were propping up the Reconstruction governments, the Republican regimes collapsed. This is the political cartoon that you're going to be doing your short answer on, called The End of Reconstruction, 1877. The Democratic South was solidified. It swiftly suppressed now friendless blacks. White Democrats, called Redeemers, relying on fraud and intimidation, reassumed political power. Blacks who tried to assert rights faced unemployment, eviction, and physical harm. Many blacks were forced into sharecropping and tenant farming. Crop lien systems where storekeepers extended credit to small farmers for food and supplies in return for a lien on the harvest. Farmers remained perpetually in debt. Southern blacks were condemned to threadbare living under conditions scarcely better than slavery. The blacks were forced into systematic state-level legal codes of segregation known as Jim Crow laws. Southern states enacted literary requirements, voter registration laws, and poll taxes. This is a map of a Southern plantation before and after the Civil War. They tolerated violent intimidation of black voters as well. Now, the Supreme Court validated the South's segregationist social order in the court decision Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 and ruled that separate but equal facilities were constitutional under Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, and that segregated in inferior schools and separated from whites virtually all So basically what really happened is that blacks were segregated in inferior schools and separated from whites in virtually all public facilities, including railroad cars, theaters, and restrooms. Southern whites dealt harshly with any black who dared to violate the South's racial code of conduct, and there were a record number of blacks lynched in the 1890s, most often for the crime of asserting themselves as equals. It would take a second Reconstruction nearly a century later to redress the racist imbalance of the Southern society. This is a picture called Jim Crow Justice that's showing a man being burned at the stake for being accused or supposedly of molesting a 4-year-old white girl. This table shows the persons in the United States lynched by year from 1882 to 2012. There were scenes of class struggle also during this time period. The railroad workers faced particularly hard times, even though the railroads continued to make huge profits. Workers were stuck with when wages were going to be cut by 10%, and President Hayes sent in federal troops to quell unrest by striking laborers. The failure of the railroad strike exposed the weakness of the labor movement. Federal courts, U.S. Army, state militias, local police all helped keep business operating at full speed. Racial and ethnic issues fractured labor unity. Divisions were especially marked between the Irish and the Chinese in California. The Chinese came originally to dig in gold fields and to sledgehammer tracks of the Transcontinental Railroad, but when the gold petered out and the tracks had been laid, many returned home to China with very meager savings. Those who remained faced extraordinary hardships, menial jobs as cooks, laundrymen, and domestic servants. Without women or families, they were deprived of the means to assimilate. And in San Francisco, Dennis Kearney incited followers to violent abuse of hapless Chinese. And then the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1882, prohibiting nearly all further immigration from China, and the door stays shut until 1943. This is a political cartoon that we'll discuss in class called The First Blow at the Chinese Question, and you can pause and read the explanation. Native-born Chinese in the Supreme Court ruling in U.S. versus Wong Kim Ark in 1898 stated that the 14th Amendment guaranteed citizenship to all persons born in the United States. The doctrine of birthright citizenship, as contrasted with the right of blood tie, which means citizenship based on parents' nationality, provided protection to Chinese Americans as well as other immigrants during this time period, and it continues to do so. This is a picture of a Chinese railroad worker with his tools and a Chinese butcher shop in San Francisco around 1890. This is the population of Chinese ancestry in the United States from 1850 to 2010 by male and female, and the percentage of U.S. born in the United States. And now we'll talk about, in our next video, the second part of the Gilded Age.